This is a story you'll want to finish. Chapter I, The Ultimatum. My mother-in-law's declaration was not a request, but a verdict, delivered by an indifferent judge in a stifling courtroom where flies buzz against the dusty panes. Your salary is $300,000 a year, and my Social Security is $2,000 a month. So, darling, from now on, you'll be supporting me. Eleanor said this standing in the middle of our living room, bathed in the pre-sunset glow, and in her small, deep-set eyes, there was not a shred of supplication. There was only triumphant contempt. Like a skilled fencer, she had found the chink in my armor, my polite upbringing, my social awkwardness, my eternal guilt for living better than the generations before me. She pinned me to the wall with that simple, brutal comparison of numbers, 300,000 and 2,000, an abyss into which, by her logic, I was expected to dutifully hurl all my strength, time, and dreams to fill it to the brim. My husband, her son, Ethan, stood beside me, pale and wretched, like a frightened boy caught between two fires. He mumbled something about, "Mom, we already help," but his voice was swallowed by the thick, confident silence his mother exuded. She merely smirked, not even deigning to look at him. I was the main adversary on this battlefield. And so she began to visit. Every day. At 9 in the morning, just as Ethan left for work, a demanding ring would pierce the quiet. She entered not as a guest, but an auditor, a new owner inspecting her property. She would patrol the rooms, running a finger over surfaces, peering into the refrigerator, criticizing the groceries I'd bought. "Avocado?" she'd sneer. "An indulgence. For this money you could have bought 6 pounds of potatoes. That would last us a week." Us. She had introduced that word into our lives instantly and imperiously. There was no longer an us, me and Ethan. There was a new we, in which I was merely the service mechanism. Her presence filled every inch of space. The air in our apartment grew thick, heavy, saturated with the scent of her old-fashioned perfume and her disapproval. I worked from home, and silence was my most essential tool. Now the soundtrack to my video conferences was her shuffling footsteps, her theatrical coughs, and her loud phone calls with friends in which she'd complain about her cold-hearted daughter-in-law who's skimping on her. I felt like a frog in slowly heating water. Annoyance was curdling into a quiet, profound rage. I would lock myself in my office, but her voice would seep under the door, a toxic ivy strangling my thoughts. In the evenings, when Ethan returned, she would transform into a frail, offended old woman, lamenting her loneliness and my cold heart. Ethan would look at me with pleading eyes, torn between his duty as a son and his loyalty as a husband. Pity for him mixed with a righteous anger at his helplessness. On the second day, I found a pharmacy receipt in the trash for expensive joint medication. She had bought it during the day with the grocery money I'd left out. That evening, she wept to Ethan that she couldn't even afford an aspirin. Deceit was her weapon, and his love was her shield. That night, looking at my husband's exhausted face and recalling her mother's triumphant gaze, I knew that arguments and pleas were pointless. You can only fight such an enemy with her own methods. On the third day, I decided it was time to act. I would prepare a welcome dinner for her that she would never forget.
Chapter 2. Preparations for the Feast. On the morning of the third day, I awoke with a feeling of icy calm. The anxiety that had churned inside me for 2 days was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The plan had formed in the night, as if dictated to me in a dream, complete with all its humiliating and cruel details. I was no longer a victim. I was the director. And tonight was my premiere. Ethan, sensing a shift in my mood, asked with hope at breakfast, "Are you going to talk to her, work things out?"
I nodded, smiling the way a surgeon must smile before a complex but necessary amputation. Yes, darling, I'll handle everything. After he left, I didn't wait for Eleanor's ring. I went downstairs myself and waited for her by the building entrance. Seeing me, she was momentarily flustered, but quickly donned her mask of martyred meekness. Decided to meet your mother, did you? Finally came to your senses. I took her arm with an uncharacteristic politeness. Eleanor, tonight I want to make a special dinner for you, in your honor, to celebrate this new chapter in our lives. She grunted with suspicion, but a greedy glint ignited in her eyes. At last, the daughter-in-law had surrendered. The fortress had fallen. My preparations were methodical and merciless. My first stop was not my usual Whole Foods with its organic vegetables and farm-fresh meat, but a no-frills discount grocer on the far side of town, a place named Value Mart. The air inside was stale, smelling of cheap grain and desperation. I grabbed a cart and got to work. My task was simple: to assemble a month's worth of groceries based on a budget of $2,000. I pulled out my calculator. $2,000 divided by 31 days. That came to $64.51 a day. For 3 people. I allowed myself a devilish bit of generosity and rounded up to 65. I bought the cheapest pasta made from gray-looking flour, a bag of the cheapest, almost powdery rice, a block of margarine instead of butter. I found canned sardines and tomato sauce, whose price was an insult to fish everywhere. The potatoes were small and sprouting. The onions were soft. My most expensive purchase was a frozen chicken back, what some call a soup bone. Staring at this pathetic mountain of food in my cart, I felt no pity. I felt the thrill of an avenger. Back home, I laid out my purchases on our stylish quartz countertop. The contrast was grotesque. I took out my kitchen scale. For tonight's welcome dinner, I weighed out the day's portion with surgical precision. 5 ounces of potato, 2 ounces of pasta, 1 ounce of chicken back, and a single onion. From this, I was to create a 3-course meal. I worked with the inspiration of a mad alchemist. The water from the boiled potato was the base for the soup. The potato itself, mashed with a dab of margarine, was the puree. A sliver of chicken skin fried with the onion became the meat gravy. The pasta, boiled to a paste, was the side dish. I set the table with our finest china: porcelain, crystal, sterling silver. In the center, I placed a single rose from a lavish bouquet Ethan had given me for our anniversary. Against the backdrop of this pauper's meal, the rose looked like a mockery. I waited. I was as calm as a python that has swallowed its prey. The apartment didn't smell of food. The apartment smelled of retribution. Chapter 3: The First Course. At 7 o'clock sharp, as arranged, the doorbell rang. On the threshold stood Eleanor and Ethan. She was wearing her best dress, a polyester frock the color of a wilted rose, and she reeked of mothballs and triumphant anticipation. She gave me a victorious look, as if to say, "See, all it took was a little pressure and you broke." Ethan looked exhausted, but a faint, relieved smile played on his lips. My poor, foolish boy. He thought the nightmare was over. He had no idea the nightmare was just beginning. "Please, come to the table," I cooed in the tone of a model daughter-in-law. I led them into the dining room. Upon seeing the formally set table, the crystal, the silver, the crisp white tablecloth, Eleanor beamed. She took the seat at the head of the table, adjusted her napkin, and prepared to savor the fruits of her victory. Ethan sat opposite her, looking at me with gratitude. He hadn't seen the plates yet. I went to the kitchen and returned with the porcelain tureen painted with pastoral scenes. I myself was wearing an expensive French perfume that Eleanor despised. I placed the tureen before her with a slight bow. "Allow me, Eleanor. Tonight you are our queen." She nodded graciously. I lifted the lid. For a moment, a silence fell over the room, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock. Inside the tureen sloshed a murky, nearly colorless liquid in which a few translucent rings of onion floated forlornly. It was somewhere between hospital slop and dishwater. Eleanor's face fell. The smile slid from her lips, replaced by a grimace of disgust. "What is this?" "It's a rustic onion soup," I answered sweetly, ladling the broth into the bowls. "A very economical and healthy recipe. I calculated that with our new family budget, this is precisely the kind of first course we can afford. Light, dietary, and easy on the wallet." Ethan stared into his bowl in horror. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with confusion. They held a silent question. "Claire, what are you doing?" I ignored his gaze, focusing all my attention on my mother-in-law.
What new budget? Eleanor's voice was taut with suppressed rage. She couldn't yet tell if this was a trap or a foolish joke. "Well, you know," I batted my eyelashes innocently. "You yourself said that I am to support you completely now. I took your words very seriously. Ethan and I discussed it and decided it would only be fair if we all lived on one combined income. My salary plus your Social Security. But you want me to support you completely, which means we ought to live as you would on your income, to truly understand your needs. So I made an executive decision. For this month, we are all three living strictly on $2,000. All of us. To get the full experience, so to speak. Try the soup before it gets cold." I took my spoon and, with a look of theatrical pleasure, took a sip of the warm water. Eleanor sat frozen, her face turning from pink to crimson. She looked from me to Ethan, expecting him to revolt at any moment, to slam his fist on the table and end this farce. But Ethan was silent. He was in shock, paralyzed by the audacity of my actions. He just stared at me with wide eyes, and I could see a battle raging in them. Horror warring with a nascent, unacknowledged admiration. The silence was deafening. My mother-in-law did not touch her soup. She was waiting. She thought this was the climax. Oh, how wrong she was. This was merely the overture. Chapter 4. The Main Course and a Dessert of Truth. The pause stretched. On, Eleanor sat with the air of an insulted empress who had been served swill. She had clearly decided that by demonstrating silent contempt, she would force me to retreat in shame and bring out a proper meal. She didn't know I had passed the point of no return. With the same charming smile, I stood, collected the nearly untouched soup bowls, and glided back to the kitchen. Ethan watched me with the eyes of a hunted animal. I could hear his mother hiss at him. "Did you see that? Are you going to let her mock your mother like this?" Ethan's voice was weak, uncertain. "Mom, wait. Maybe this is some kind of mistake." I returned, carrying the main course on a large silver platter, covered with a gleaming cloche. The drama, the theater. I placed the platter in the center of the table. "I do hope you enjoy the entree, Eleanor. This is the centerpiece of tonight's program." With those words, I swept off the lid. There, on the enormous platter, lay 3 sad little piles of grayish, sticky pasta. Next to them, 3 boiled potatoes. And the crowning glory of the composition was a tiny ramekin of what I called meat gravy. A few shreds of fried onion and chicken skin.
The presentation was executed with such mocking fastidiousness that it ceased to be a joke and became an act of pure, distilled humiliation. This is where Eleanor finally broke. She shot to her feet, knocking her chair over. The china on the table rattled. You, you, you ungrateful wretch, she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. Her face was contorted with fury. I gave you my best years. I gave you my son, and you feed me garbage? Do you think I will let you treat me this way? I'll... Sit down, Eleanor. My voice was so quiet and even that it cut her off mid-sentence. There was no anger in it, no hysteria, only steel. She looked at me, astonished. I was no longer the fawning daughter-in-law. Someone else was sitting in her place. I rose slowly and walked to the sideboard. I opened a drawer and took out a slim file folder. You see, I didn't just practice my cooking today. I also did a little work in my actual profession. I'm an analyst, in case you've forgotten. And I'm very, very good at finding information. Ethan stared at me, understanding nothing. His mother-in-law eyed the folder with suspicion. "What is that?" she asked, her voice now much quieter. "That's dessert. A dessert of truth. It's a bit bitter, but very sobering. Open it." Her hands trembled as she opened the folder. On the first page was a printout from the county records office. A property deed transfer. A country property up in Pine Ridge. 1 acre, 2-story cabin. I read aloud, like a news anchor. Sold 1.5 months ago. Sale price, $150,000. Buyer is a Mr. Davison. Does that name sound familiar, Eleanor? My mother-in-law was silent. Her face was ashen. Ethan jumped to his feet. "Mom, what cabin? You told us the paperwork was lost in a fire, that it was impossible to sell." I turned the page. And this is even more interesting. 2 studio condos at the West Haven complex. They've been rented out for the last 3 years. The leases are in your sister's name, but the bank account where the $3,000 in monthly rent is deposited belongs to you. Here's the bank statement. I placed the printout in front of her. The balance, with the comma and plenty of zeros after it, glowed like a Vegas marquee. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the blood pounding in your ears. Ethan looked from the documents to his mother's ghostly white face. His world, built on the holy belief in his poor, unfortunate mother, was collapsing before his eyes, burying him in the rubble. "So, Eleanor," I finished my monologue, taking my seat again, "the question isn't why your Social Security is only $2,000 a month. The question is why you lied to your own son, and why you decided that my salary was also your property." I picked up my fork and speared a gray noodle with gusto. Bon appetit. Chapter 5. Epilogue in an empty apartment. What followed was like a volcanic eruption. Eleanor, momentarily stunned by the exposé, pivoted from fury to denial. She screamed that the documents were forgeries, that it was all slander, that I was trying to vilify her, to paint her as a monster, to possess her son completely. She grabbed the papers from the table, crumpling them, trying to tear them, but her hands were shaking too violently to succeed. She appealed to Ethan, begging him to open his eyes and see the snake he was married to. But her panic, her disjointed, rambling speech, was the best proof of my claims. Ethan stood as if struck by lightning. He wasn't looking at me. His entire world had narrowed to a single point, his mother. I saw in his eyes not anger, not hurt, but something far worse. Total, crushing disillusionment. It was the feeling a child has upon suddenly discovering his favorite hero is just an actor in a cheap suit. He saw not a poor pensioner, but a calculating, deceitful manipulator, and that knowledge was unbearable for him.
"Mom," he finally said, his voice hollow and foreign, "is this true?" That simple question was like a gunshot in the deafening silence, and Eleanor knew she had lost. Her shrieks died out. She looked at her son, and a flicker of fear crossed her eyes. She understood that she had destroyed not my dinner plans, but something far more important, his faith. She didn't answer. Instead, with an agility that belied her age, she snatched her handbag, shot me a look so full of pure hatred that I felt it like a physical blow, and shuffled furiously out of the apartment. The door slammed shut behind her. We were left alone in the room with the cooling dinner and the tattered scraps of truth scattered across the table. We were silent for a long time. Ethan sank into a chair and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. I didn't go to him, didn't try to comfort him. This was his pain, his grief for a lost illusion, and he had to endure it himself. I just sat nearby, giving him time and space. I felt no triumph, only emptiness and a bitter exhaustion. My shock therapy had worked, but the poison had affected not only the patient, but everyone nearby. Finally, he lifted his head. His eyes were red. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I was such a blind idiot." "You have nothing to be sorry for," I answered just as quietly. "She's your mother. You loved her and you trusted her." He gave a bitter laugh. Loved. Trusted. Past tense. That night, he called her himself. I didn't hear the conversation. He went into his office. It didn't last long. When Ethan came out, his face was gray, but there was something new in it, a resolve I had never seen before. I told her that she is welcome in our home only when we invite her, and that there will be financial help, but only what we decide to give, and only after she apologizes to you. I knew the apology would never come, which meant the visits would never come either. That night, for the first time in a long while, we slept peacefully in our own apartment. The air was clean and light again, but something had changed between us forever. We had survived, our family had not broken, and had perhaps even grown stronger, forged in that fire. But I knew the scars would remain. I had won the war for my territory, but at what cost? I looked at Ethan sleeping and thought about how sometimes, to save something living, you have to scorch the earth around it with the white-hot iron. And the smell of that burning would haunt me in my quietest dreams for a long, long time. Stories are born from emotion. If this story made you feel something, please share your thoughts. Every comment is a spark of inspiration for new stories of struggle, strength, and the hope that never fades, even in the harshest of realities. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, and you'll hear even more compelling tales.